The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the dusty depot, and Josephine Adams pressed her gloved hand against the wooden wall to steady herself, her heart hammering so hard she thought the other passengers might hear it. She had traveled nearly 1,000 miles from Boston to Madisonville, Texas, answering an advertisement placed by a rancher named Franklin Locke. And now that she was finally here in this sun-scorched town in the spring of 1878, all she could think about was the deception she had been carrying like a stone in her chest for the past 3 weeks. She had not told him about her leg. The accident had happened when she was 14, a carriage collision that shattered her left femur and left it healing crooked, despite the doctor's best efforts. The limp was noticeable, unmistakable, a hitching gait that made her body dip to the left with every other step. In Boston, she had grown accustomed to the pitying stares, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the young men who looked away when she passed. At 22 years old, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood until she saw the advertisement in the newspaper, a rancher seeking a wife. No mention of beauty or perfection, just someone willing to work hard and build a life in Texas. She had written back immediately, pouring her heart into the letter, telling him about her love of reading, her skill with numbers, her willingness to learn ranching. She had told him everything except the one thing that defined how the world saw her. The driver opened the door and extended his hand, and Josephine took a deep breath before accepting it. She stepped down carefully, letting her right foot touch the ground first, then bringing her left leg down with that familiar, awkward motion that made her stomach clench with shame. The driver did not comment, but she saw his eyes flicker downward for just a moment before he turned to fetch her trunk. Madisonville's main street stretched before her, a row of wooden buildings baking under the Texas sun. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop with its door thrown open to catch whatever breeze might stir. Heat shimmered off the packed earth, and the air smelled of horses and dust, and something green she could not quite identify. A few people moved along the wooden sidewalks, going about their business, and Josephine felt every one of their gazes land on her like a physical touch. She wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that she had carefully mended and pressed before packing it, and her dark blonde hair was pinned up beneath her bonnet. She knew she was not beautiful, but she had hoped she might be pretty enough, capable enough, to make a man happy. Now, standing in this strange town with the weight of her secret pressing down on her, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "Miss Adams?" The voice was deep and uncertain, and Josephine turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the general store. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of long days working outdoors. He wore worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. As he drew closer, she could see his features more clearly, a strong jaw, a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and eyes the color of warm honey that studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Locke?" "Franklin," he said, and there was something almost shy in the way he said it, as though he was not accustomed to introducing himself. He stopped a few feet away, and she saw his gaze travel over her face, her shoulders, her hands still clasped in front of her. "I am glad you made it safely. The journey must have been hard." "It was long," Josephine said, "but I'm grateful to be here." They stood there for a moment, two strangers trying to reconcile the words they had exchanged in letters with the reality of flesh and blood standing before them. In his letters, Franklin had been thoughtful and earnest, describing his ranch with obvious pride, asking her questions about her life and interests. She had imagined him 100 different ways during the journey, but none of her imaginings had quite prepared her for the reality of him, for the way his presence seemed to fill the space around him without any effort at all. "I have a wagon," he said finally, gesturing toward the far end of the street, where a sturdy-looking wagon stood hitched to 2 horses. "The ranch is about 5 miles out. We can talk more there if that suits you." "Of course," Josephine said, and her heart began to race again. This was it. She would have to walk to the wagon and he would see her limp, and everything she had hoped for would crumble like dried clay. Franklin moved to pick up her trunk, lifting it as though it weighed nothing, and started toward the wagon. Josephine followed, focusing on keeping her steps as even as possible, but it was no use. The uneven ground made it worse, and she felt her body dip sharply with each left step. She kept her eyes fixed on Franklin's back, waiting for him to turn around, waiting for his expression to change. They reached the wagon, and he set her trunk in the back with careful precision before turning to help her up to the seat. His hands were large and calloused as they steadied her, and she climbed up as quickly as she could, grateful to be sitting down. He swung up beside her and took the reins, clicking softly to the horses, and they began to move through town at a steady pace. Josephine waited for him to say something, but he remained quiet, his attention seemingly focused on the road ahead. They passed the last buildings of Madisonville and emerged into open country, rolling grassland dotted with scrub oak and mesquite trees. The sky stretched overhead in a vast expanse of blue that seemed to go on forever, so different from the narrow streets and tall buildings of Boston. "You did not mention it in your letters," Franklin said finally, and Josephine's stomach dropped. "I know," she whispered. "I should have. I was afraid that if I told you, you would not want me to come." "What happened?" His voice was not unkind, but she heard the question beneath the question. Why did you deceive me? She owed him the truth now, at least. "A carriage accident when I was 14, she said, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. "My leg was badly broken. It healed, but not straight. I have walked with a limp ever since." Franklin was quiet for a long moment, and Josephine felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry, not here, not now. If he wanted to send her back to Boston, she would go with whatever dignity she could muster. "Does it pain you?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when the weather changes or if I have been on my feet too long. But I can work. I am not fragile, Mr. Locke. I can learn to do whatever needs doing." "Franklin," he corrected gently, "if we are to be married, I would like you to call me by my given name." Josephine turned to look at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You still want to marry me?" He glanced at her, and there was something in his expression she could not quite read, a complicated mix of emotions that passed too quickly for her to name. "You came all this way. That took courage. Whatever your reasons for not telling me before, I respect courage." "But I lied to you," she said, needing him to understand. "By omission, at least." "You did," he agreed, "and I will not pretend I am pleased about that. But I also know what it is like to be afraid that something about you will make people turn away." He paused, and his jaw tightened. "My father was a drunk who beat my mother until she died when I was 12. I have his blood in my veins. Some folks think that makes me just like him, that I will turn mean someday no matter what I do. They look at me and see him, not me." Josephine's chest ached at the pain in his voice, the old wound that clearly had not healed. "That is not fair," she said fiercely. "You are not responsible for what your father did." "No," Franklin said, "and you are not responsible for an accident that happened when you were a child. We are who we choose to be, Miss Adams, not what happens to us." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, less fraught with tension. Josephine found herself studying Franklin's profile when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way his hands held the reins with gentle confidence, the way he scanned the horizon as though looking for something. There was a steadiness to him that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that perhaps everything might actually be all right. The ranch appeared gradually, materializing out of the prairie like something conjured. First there was a fence line, well-maintained and sturdy, then a dirt road that led to a cluster of buildings. The main house was modest but well-built, a single-story structure made of lumber with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Behind it stood a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in a distant pasture, their red and white forms moving slowly against the green grass. "It is not much," Franklin said, and she heard the uncertainty in his voice again, as though he was seeing it through her eyes and finding it wanting. "It is beautiful," Josephine said honestly. "It looks like a home." Something in his expression softened, and he guided the wagon up to the house. A dog came bounding out to meet them, a large brown and white animal with flopping ears and an enthusiastically wagging tail. Franklin jumped down and scratched the dog behind the ears before coming around to help Josephine down from the wagon. His hands closed around her waist, strong and sure, and he lifted her down as though she weighed nothing. For a moment she stood close enough to him to catch the scent of soap and leather and something else that was just him, and her breath caught in her throat. Then he stepped back, putting proper distance between them, and bent to retrieve her trunk. "I will show you inside, no," he said. "There is a room you can use. We can be married in town whenever you are ready. I will not rush you into anything, Miss Adams. You should have time to be certain this is what you want." Josephine followed him into the house, her limp more pronounced now after sitting for so long. The interior was dim and cool after the brightness outside, and she blinked as her eyes adjusted. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a solid table with 4 chairs in the center. Everything was clean and orderly, almost austere in its simplicity. Franklin led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom. It held a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a dresser, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. A single window looked out toward the pasture. "It is not fancy," he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed, "but the roof does not leak, and the bed is comfortable. I sleep in the room at the other end of the hall. You will have your privacy." "Thank you," Josephine said. "It is more than adequate." Franklin nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Adams, I want you to know something. I asked for a mail-order bride because I am not good with words, and I'm not handsome. And I know that if I tried courting in the usual way, I would make a mess of things, but I am a hard worker, and I am honest, and I will do my best to be a good husband to you. That is all I can promise." "You are wrong about one thing," Josephine said before she could stop herself. He turned back, his brow furrowed. "What is that?" "You are handsome," she said, feeling her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "Very much so." For a moment Franklin just stared at her, his eyes wide with surprise. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his features entirely. It was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds, and Josephine felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "I will let you rest," he said, but his voice was warmer now, less formal. "There is water in the pitcher, and I will bring in more later. Supper will be ready around 6. Nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits." "I can help," Josephine offered. "I am a decent cook, and I would like to earn my keep." "You're not a hired hand, Miss Adams. You are to be my wife." "Then let me behave as a wife would," she said firmly. "I did not come all this way to sit idle while you do everything." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Come out when you're ready, and I will show you where everything is." After he left, Josephine sank down onto the bed and let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. Her trunk sat at her feet, containing everything she owned in the world, and around her was a strange house in a strange land, belonging to a man she had known for less than an hour. By all rights, she should be terrified. Instead, she felt something else, something tentative and fragile, but unmistakably real. She felt hope. She unpacked a few of her things, hanging her spare dress on a peg on the wall and arranging her toiletries on the dresser. The pitcher held fresh water, and she poured some into the basin to wash the dust of travel from her face and hands. When she felt more presentable, she made her way back to the main room. Franklin was at the fireplace, stirring something in a large pot that hung over the flames. He had removed his hat, and she could see his hair was a dark brown, slightly wavy and in need of a trim. The dog lay near his feet, watching his every move with devoted attention. "That is Bear," Franklin said without turning around. "He looks fierce, but he would not hurt a fly. He just wants everyone to be his friend." As if to prove the point, Bear got up and trotted over to Josephine, pressing his nose into her hand. She scratched his head, smiling despite herself. "The biscuits are already made," Franklin continued. "I just need to put them in the Dutch oven to bake. I'm not much of a cook, but I manage." "Let me help," Josephine said, moving closer. "Where is the Dutch oven?" He pointed to a heavy cast iron pot sitting near the hearth, and she retrieved it, noticing how he watched her carefully as she walked. She was aware of her limp in a way that made her self-conscious, but she refused to let it stop her. She had meant what she said about not being fragile. They worked together in companionable silence, Franklin tending the stew while Josephine arranged the biscuits in the Dutch oven and buried it in the coals to bake. It felt strangely domestic, this simple act of preparing a meal together, and Josephine found herself relaxing in increments. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, wanting to break the silence. 6 years, Franklin said. "I worked as a ranch hand for nearly 10 years before that, saving every penny I could. When the man I worked for decided to sell off some of his land, he gave me first chance to buy a piece of it. It is not a big spread, but it is mine." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Josephine understood it. This was what he had built with his own hands, his own sweat. It represented freedom and independence, a life he had chosen rather than one forced upon him. "Do you run it alone?" she asked. "Mostly. I hire help during roundup and branding, but the rest of the year I manage on my own. I have about 200 head of cattle right now. I would like to expand, but that takes money and time." "What do you do when you are injured or ill?" He shrugged. "I manage. I have been lucky so far." "That is not luck," Josephine said. "That is stubbornness." He glanced at her, and there was amusement in his eyes. "Are you calling me stubborn, Miss Adams?" "I am calling you practical enough to recognize that having help would be beneficial," she said primly, "which is, I assume, part of why you wanted a wife." "Part of it," he agreed, "but not all of it." "What is the rest?" He turned his attention back to the stew, stirring slowly. "I am tired of being alone," he said quietly. "I am 30 years old, and I have worked hard to build something good here. But at the end of the day, there is no one to share it with. No one to talk to except Bear. And he is not much of a conversationalist. I want a family, Miss Adams. I want children and noise and someone to sit with on the porch in the evening. I want what my parents never had, what I never had growing up. A real home." The raw honesty in his words struck something deep in Josephine's chest. "That is what I want too," she said softly. "In Boston, I was always on the outside looking in. My father died when I was 16, and my mother passed 2 years ago. I have been living with my aunt, but she has 4 children of her own, and I was just another mouth to feed. No man there would court me because of my leg, and I was slowly becoming invisible, just the spinster niece who helped with the children and kept the house. I want more than that. I want to matter to someone." Franklin turned to look at her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart skip. "You matter," he said. "You came all this way because you had the courage to try for something better. That matters." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and Josephine felt something shift between them, some invisible wall crumbling. This was not the romantic fantasy she had sometimes imagined as a girl, with grand declarations and sweeping gestures. This was something more real, more solid. Two people who had been hurt by life, who had been made to feel less than they were, finding understanding in each other. The smell of baking biscuits filled the air, and Franklin smiled. "I think those are about done." They ate at the table, the food simple but filling. The stew was thick with vegetables and chunks of beef, and the biscuits were golden and flaky. Josephine was hungrier than she had realized, and she ate with genuine appetite while Franklin told her about the ranch, about his neighbors, about the rhythms of life in this part of Texas. His voice was deep and pleasant, and she found herself watching the way his hands moved as he talked, the way his face became animated when he spoke about something he cared about. After supper, Franklin insisted on washing the dishes while Josephine dried and put them away. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink visible through the window, he suggested they sit on the porch for a while. "The sunsets here are something special," he said. "I never get tired of watching them." They sat in 2 wooden chairs on the porch, Bear sprawled at their feet, and watched as the colors deepened and shifted. The air was cooling now, no longer the oppressive heat of midday, and Josephine could hear crickets beginning their evening song. The land stretched out before them, vast and open, and she felt very small and very far from everything she had ever known. "Are you afraid?" Franklin asked quietly. "A little," she admitted. "This is all so different from what I am used to. But I think I'm more excited than afraid." "Good," he said. "Fear is natural, but it should not rule us." "Is that why you did not turn me away when you saw my limp?" Josephine asked, then wished she could take the words back. She did not want to keep returning to this, did not want her disability to define everything between them. But Franklin did not seem bothered by the question. "I did not turn you away because it does not change who you are," he said simply. "You are still the woman who wrote me those letters, who told me about the books you love and the way you want to learn everything. Your limp does not erase any of that. It is just part of you, like my height or my broken nose or the scar on my hand from a rope burn. It makes you who you are." Josephine felt tears sting her eyes, but this time she did not try to hide them. "No one has ever said anything like that to me before." "Then you have been surrounded by fools," Franklin said bluntly. "Anyone who cannot see past a limp to the person underneath is not worth your time." She laughed, a watery sound, and wiped at her eyes. "You are very kind, Franklin." "I am honest," he corrected. "There is a difference." They sat together as the stars began to appear, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds on velvet. Josephine thought about all the miles she had traveled, all the fear and uncertainty she had carried with her, and felt it beginning to lift. She was not home yet, not quite, but she was closer than she had ever been. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both strange and comforting. Josephine rose early, unused to the rooster's crow that announced dawn but determined to adapt. She would dress and make her way to the kitchen where Franklin was usually already up, starting coffee. Together they would make breakfast, then Franklin would head out to tend the cattle while Josephine familiarized herself with the house. She discovered that while Franklin kept things clean, there were small touches missing that a woman's hand might add. She found fabric in one of the trunks in the spare room and began sewing curtains for the windows. She reorganized the kitchen to make it more efficient, and she started a small herb garden near the back door with seeds she found in the general store when Franklin took her to town that first Saturday. Madisonville was busier on the weekend, and Josephine felt eyes on her as they walked together down the main street. Franklin kept a protective hand on her lower back, guiding her around obstacles, his presence solid and reassuring. They stopped at the general store, where the proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, greeted Franklin warmly and studied Josephine with undisguised curiosity. "So this is your mail order, bride," he said, not unkindly. "Welcome to Madisonville, miss. If there is anything you need, you just let me know." "Thank you," Josephine said, smiling despite her self-consciousness. They bought supplies, fabric and thread, coffee and sugar, a few other necessities. As Franklin loaded the packages into the wagon, a woman approached them. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and graying brown hair tucked under a bonnet. "Franklin Locke, you did not tell me your bride had arrived," she said, though her tone was teasing rather than accusatory. "Mrs. Patterson," Franklin said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "I apologize for the oversight. Josephine. This is Margaret Patterson. She and her husband own the ranch adjacent to mine. Margaret, this is Josephine Adams." "Soon to be Josephine Locke, I hope," Margaret said, taking Josephine's hand in both of hers. "My dear, you must come for supper soon. I am desperate for female company. Living surrounded by ranch hands and my husband means I spend far too much time talking about cattle and horses." "I would like that very much," Josephine said, warmed by the woman's genuine friendliness. "How about next Sunday?" Margaret suggested. "We can have a proper meal, and you can tell me all about Boston. I have never been farther east than Fort Worth, and I want to hear about the big city." They made the arrangements, and as Margaret walked away, Josephine felt her spirits lift even further. She had been worried about isolation, about being cut off from any kind of social life, but perhaps that would not be the case after all. "Margaret is good people," Franklin said as they climbed back into the wagon. "She has helped me more times than I can count. Her husband Thomas is the one who sold me the land for my ranch." "She seems lovely," Josephine said. "She's been wanting me to get married for years," Franklin admitted, his ears going slightly red. "She is always trying to introduce me to one woman or another when I go to town. I think she has given up on me several times over." "Well, you have saved her the trouble now," Josephine said lightly. The ride back to the ranch was pleasant, the morning sun warm but not yet oppressive. Josephine found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, noticing details she had missed before, the way the grass rippled in the breeze like water, the birds that wheeled overhead, their calls sharp and clear, the clusters of wildflowers that dotted the roadside in splashes of yellow and purple. "It is beautiful here," she said. "Different from Massachusetts, but beautiful in its own way." "I'm glad you think so," Franklin said. "Some people find it too harsh, too empty, but I love it. There is room to breathe here." Back at the ranch, they fell into their separate tasks. Franklin rode out to check on the cattle in the far pasture, and Josephine set about making bread and cleaning the house. She found the physical work satisfying, even when her leg began to ache from being on her feet too long. She was determined to prove herself capable, to show Franklin that his faith in her was not misplaced. In the evening, they ate the bread with butter and cold beef left over from the night before, and Franklin taught her how to play checkers. They sat at the table with the board between them, the lamp casting warm light over the room, and Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in years. Franklin was better at the game than she was, but he was patient, pointing out moves she had missed and praising her when she made a clever play. "You are a quick learner," he said, after she managed to jump 3 of his pieces in a row. "I had a good teacher," she replied. As the days turned into a week, then 2, Josephine found herself falling into a rhythm with Franklin that felt natural and right. They talked easily now, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing their hopes for the future. Franklin spoke of expanding the herd, of eventually building a bigger house. Josephine talked about her love of reading, and Franklin surprised her by producing a small collection of books he kept in a trunk in his room. "I am not educated," he said almost apologetically, "but I taught myself to read when I was a boy. The foreman on the ranch where I worked let me borrow his books sometimes. I know I'm not good at it, but I try." "That makes it all the more admirable," Josephine said, touched by this glimpse into his past. "Reading is a gift you gave yourself." She began reading aloud to him in the evenings, and it became her favorite part of the day. They would sit on the porch, or if it was too hot or too windy, in the main room, and she would read while he worked on small tasks, mending tack or sharpening tools. He was a good listener, asking questions and making comments that showed he was following along. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Franklin set down the bridle he had been oiling and cleared his throat. "Josephine, I have been thinking." She looked up from the book in her lap, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets that she had brought from Boston. "Yes? We have been living here together for nearly a month now, and I think we have gotten to know each other reasonably well. I do not want to pressure you, but I would like to know if you have given any thought to when you might want to get married." Josephine's heart began to race. She had been thinking about it constantly, truth be told, but she had not known how to broach the subject. "I have given it a great deal of thought," she said carefully. "And?" Franklin looked almost nervous, his hands stilling on the leather. "And I think we should set a date," Josephine said. "I did not come here to live in limbo, Franklin. I came here to marry you and build a life together. If you are still willing, I am ready." Something in his expression softened, and he smiled that transformative smile that made her breath catch. "I am more than willing," he said. "I will speak to the minister in town. Would next Saturday suit you?" "Next Saturday would be perfect," Josephine said, and she felt a flutter of nervousness and excitement in her stomach. The week that followed was a whirlwind of preparation. Josephine altered one of her dresses, adding lace trim she purchased on another trip to town. Margaret Patterson heard about the upcoming wedding and descended on the ranch with fabric and ribbon, insisting on helping Josephine make the dress as beautiful as possible. "A woman only gets married once, if she is lucky," Margaret said, her needle flying through the fabric with expert precision. "You should look your best." "It is just a small ceremony," Josephine protested, but she was touched by Margaret's enthusiasm. "That does not matter," Margaret said firmly. "What matters is that you feel special. Franklin is a good man, Josephine. He deserves a wife who knows her own worth." On the morning of the wedding, Josephine woke before dawn, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She dressed carefully in the altered gown, which was now a confection of blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her hair up and let a few tendrils curl around her face, and when she studied herself in the small mirror over the dresser, she thought she looked happier than she had in years. Franklin was waiting in the main room dressed in his Sunday best. Dark trousers, a white shirt, a black vest. He had trimmed his hair and shaved carefully, and when he saw her, his eyes widened. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you," Josephine said, feeling her cheeks heat. "You look very handsome yourself." They rode to town together, the morning air cool and fresh. The church was a small white building at the edge of Madisonville, and inside they found Margaret and Thomas Patterson waiting for them, along with a few other neighbors who had heard about the wedding and wanted to attend. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. The minister, an elderly man with a shock of white hair, spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about the commitment they were making to each other. Franklin's hand was warm and steady as he held hers, and when he spoke his vows, his voice was clear and firm. "I, Franklin Locke, take you, Josephine Adams, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to care for you, and to stand by you in all circumstances. I promise to build a life with you that is founded on respect and honesty. I promise to be faithful to you all the days of my life." Josephine repeated her own vows, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Franklin leaned down and kissed her gently, his lips warm and soft against hers. It was her first kiss, and she felt it all the way to her toes. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the Patterson Ranch, with food and music and dancing. Josephine sat on a bench and watched as Franklin was pulled into conversation with Thomas and some of the other ranchers, and Margaret came to sit beside her. "You look happy," Margaret said. "I am," Josephine said. "I know it is early days yet, but I feel like I made the right choice coming here." "Franklin is lucky to have you," Margaret said. "He has been alone too long. He needs someone to remind him that life is about more than just work." As the sun began to set, Franklin came to collect her, and they rode back to the ranch together as husband and wife. The house looked the same as always, but everything felt different now. This was truly her home, and Franklin was truly her husband. Inside, Franklin lit the lamps while Josephine removed her bonnet and gloves. When he turned to face her, there was a question in his eyes. "I know we have not talked much about expectations, Honoriner," he said carefully. "I want you to know that I will not force anything on you. We can take this at whatever pace you are comfortable with." Josephine stepped closer to him, her heart pounding. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "But Franklin, I did not marry you to have a business arrangement. I married you because I want a real marriage, in every sense." His eyes darkened, and he reached out to cup her face in his hands. "Are you certain?" "I am certain," she said. He kissed her then, more deeply than before, and Josephine felt herself melting into him. His arms came around her, strong and secure, and she wrapped her own arms around his neck. When he lifted her and carried her to his room, she did not protest. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to seal the bond they had been building since the day she arrived. The night was tender and careful, Franklin taking his time, making sure she was comfortable, whispering endearments against her skin. Josephine had been nervous, uncertain of what to expect, but Franklin was gentle and patient, and by the end she felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Josephine's head on Franklin's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. "More than all right," she murmured. "I feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." "So do I," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The months that followed were the happiest Josephine had ever known. She threw herself into life on the ranch, learning everything Franklin would teach her. She learned how to milk the cow, how to collect eggs from the chickens, how to make butter and cheese. She learned how to recognize when a cow was about to calve and how to spot signs of illness in the animals. Franklin was endlessly patient, showing her techniques over and over until she got them right, never making her feel foolish or incapable. Her limp was sometimes a hindrance, especially when the ground was uneven or when she had to move quickly, but she learned to compensate. Franklin built her a sturdy walking stick that she could use when needed, carving the handle with careful precision. She protested at first, but he insisted. "There is no shame in using tools that make life easier," he said. "This is no different than me using a rope to catch a calf instead of trying to wrestle it down with my bare hands." She used the stick when she needed it and found that it did indeed help, especially on the days when her leg ached more than usual. Franklin never commented on it, never treated her any differently on the days when she struggled more than others. He simply adjusted their plans accordingly, taking on tasks that required more standing or walking without making a fuss about it. By summer, Josephine felt like she had lived on the ranch her entire life. She knew every corner of the property, knew the personality of each cow and horse and chicken. She knew which section of the garden got the best sun for tomatoes and which corner was too shady for anything but herbs. She knew the sound Franklin's boots made on the porch when he came home in the evening, and she knew the exact angle of his smile when he was pleased about something. She also knew she was falling in love with him. It had happened gradually, so slowly that she had not realized it was happening until one day she looked at him across the dinner table and felt her heart squeeze with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. She loved the way he laughed at her jokes, even the terrible ones. She loved the way he always made sure she had the comfortable chair on the porch. She loved the way he looked at her, as though she was something precious and irreplaceable. One evening in late July, they were sitting on the porch watching the stars when Josephine gathered her courage. "Franklin," she said softly, He was leaning back in his chair, relaxed and content. "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, and something in her expression must have alerted him because he sat up straighter. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," she said quickly, "nothing is wrong. It is just that I have been feeling something and I think you should know." "All right," he said carefully. "I love you," Josephine said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know we married for practical reasons, and I know you have been nothing but kind and patient with me, and I do not expect you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know that somewhere along the way I fell in love with you." For a long moment, Franklin just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly a smile spread across his face, that beautiful, transformative smile that she loved so much. "Josephine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have been in love with you since the day you told me I was handsome. Maybe even before that, when I read your first letter and thought, this woman sounds like someone I could talk to for the rest of my life. I have been trying to work up the courage to tell you for weeks now." "You have?" Josephine felt tears spring to her eyes. "I have," he confirmed. He stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. "I love you, Josephine Locke. I love your intelligence and your determination. I love the way you read to me in the evenings and the way you hum while you cook. I love how you refuse to let your leg define you, and I love that you came all this way to take a chance on a stranger." She reached up and pulled his head down to kiss him, pouring all her feelings into it. He responded in kind, holding her close, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I think we should go inside," Franklin murmured against her ear. "I think you're right," Josephine agreed. That night was different from the others, charged with the knowledge that they loved each other, that this was not just affection or companionship, but something deeper and more profound. Josephine fell asleep wrapped in Franklin's arms, feeling more content and secure than she had ever felt in her life. As the summer faded into fall, Josephine began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and she felt different, her body changing in subtle ways. She waited until she was certain before telling Franklin, not wanting to raise his hopes prematurely. One evening in late October, after they had finished supper and were sitting in the main room, Josephine cleared her throat. "Franklin, I have something to tell you." He looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I am fairly certain that I am with child," she said, watching his face carefully. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides to pull her into his arms. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice trembling. "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," she said, "but all the signs are there." "We will go to town tomorrow," he said immediately. "We will see the doctor and make sure everything is all right." "Franklin, I am fine," she protested. "Women have babies all the time." "I do not care," he said firmly. "I want to make sure you and the baby are healthy. We are going to town tomorrow." True to his word, they rode into Madisonville the next day and saw the doctor, an older man named Dr. Simmons, who had been practicing in the area for 30 years. He examined Josephine thoroughly and confirmed what she already knew. "You are about 3 months along, I would say," he told them. "The baby should arrive sometime in late April or early May. Everything looks good, but I want you to take it easy, Mrs. Locke. No heavy lifting, and make sure you are eating well." "I will make sure of it," Franklin said before Josephine could respond. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and winter. Josephine felt well most days, though she tired more easily and her leg ached more frequently from the extra weight she was carrying. Franklin was solicitous to the point of being overbearing, constantly fussing over her and trying to take over all her chores. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she finally told him in exasperation after he tried to stop her from collecting eggs from the chicken coop. "I know," he said, looking sheepish. "I just worry. I could not bear it if something happened to you or the baby." Her irritation melted away, and she cupped his face in her hands. "I know you are worried, but you need to trust that I know my own limits. I promise I will not do anything that puts me or the baby at risk." He sighed and nodded. "All right. I will try to give you some space, but if you need anything at all, you tell me immediately." "I will," she promised. Winter in Texas was milder than what she had known in Massachusetts, but there were still cold days and nights when the wind howled around the house. Franklin made sure the fireplaces were always stocked with wood, and Josephine spent much of her time knitting tiny garments for the baby and reading by the fire. Margaret Patterson visited regularly, bringing advice and baby clothes her own children had outgrown. "I know you are making things," she said, "but babies need so many clothes, and there's no point in you spending all your time sewing when I have perfectly good things that are just gathering dust." Josephine was grateful for the friendship and for the practical help. Margaret had raised 3 children of her own and had a wealth of knowledge to share. She answered Josephine's nervous questions with patience and humor, reassuring her that everything she was feeling was normal. As winter gave way to spring, Josephine grew larger and more uncomfortable. Her leg ached constantly now, and she relied on her walking stick more and more. Franklin worried, but she tried to reassure him that it was just the natural course of things. "It will be over soon," she said, though privately she was counting the days until the baby arrived. In late April, on a warm evening when the air smelled of rain, Josephine's labor began. Franklin rode into town to fetch Dr. Simmons and Margaret, then paced the porch like a caged animal while the women tended to Josephine. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Josephine had never experienced such pain, and there were moments when she wondered if she would survive it. But Margaret was there, holding her hand and urging her on, and Dr. Simmons was calm and competent. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Josephine felt the baby slip free, and a thin wail filled the room. "It is a boy, doctor," Simmons announced, holding up the squirming, red-faced infant. "A healthy boy." Josephine started to cry, overwhelmed with relief and joy. Margaret was crying too, laughing and wiping at her eyes. "Let me see him," Josephine said, reaching out. Dr. Simmons cleaned the baby quickly and placed him in her arms. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and a scrunched-up face that looked so much like Franklin it made her heart ache. She counted his fingers and toes, marveling at how tiny and perfect he was. "Can Franklin come in now?" she asked. "I will get him," Margaret said, slipping out of the room. A moment later, Franklin burst through the door, his face pale and his eyes wild. When he saw Josephine holding the baby, he stopped in his tracks. "Is he all right? Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We are both fine," Josephine said, smiling through her tears. "Come meet your son." Franklin approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. He sat down on the edge and looked at the baby, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "He is so small," he whispered. "He will grow," Josephine said. "Do you want to hold him?" Franklin nodded mutely, and she carefully transferred the baby into his arms. He held the infant with exquisite care as though he might break, and Josephine watched as her strong, capable husband melted completely. "Hello, little one," Franklin murmured. "I am your papa. I am going to do my best to be a good one, I promise." Josephine felt her heart swell with love for this man, for their son, for the life they had built together. "What should we name him?" Franklin asked, looking up at her. They had discussed names over the winter, but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her son, Josephine knew exactly what felt right. "I would like to name him Samuel," she said, "after my father." "Samuel Locke," Franklin said, testing it out. "I like it. Hello, Samuel." The baby made a small sound, and Franklin laughed, a joyful sound that filled the room. Over the next few weeks, Josephine recovered from the birth while learning to care for Samuel. He was a good baby, sleeping reasonably well and nursing eagerly. Franklin was completely besotted, spending every spare moment holding his son and talking to him, even though Samuel was far too young to understand. "I want him to know my voice," Franklin explained when Josephine teased him about it. "I want him to always know he is loved." "He will," Josephine assured him. "He has the best father he could ask for." As Samuel grew, Josephine marveled at how perfectly he fit into their lives. She had worried that she would not be able to manage with her leg, but she adapted, finding ways to hold him while still using her walking stick when necessary. Franklin built a cradle that rocked gently, and Josephine would set it near her while she worked so she could watch Samuel sleep. Margaret visited often, bringing food and advice and offering to watch Samuel so Josephine could rest. "You need to take care of yourself too," she reminded Josephine more than once. "A baby needs a healthy mother." By the time Samuel was 6 months old, he was a chubby, happy baby who smiled readily and was beginning to make babbling sounds. Franklin was convinced he was a genius. "Did you hear that?" he would say excitedly. "He said Dada. I am certain of it." "He is making sounds, Franklin," Josephine would say, amused. "He is not actually talking yet." "He said Dada," Franklin insisted stubbornly. They settled into a new rhythm, the three of them. The ranch prospered, the herd growing steadily. Franklin hired a young man named James to help with the heavy work, and Josephine was grateful for the extra pair of hands. It allowed Franklin to spend more time with Samuel, and she loved watching the two of them together. One evening in the fall, when Samuel was nearly a year old, Josephine and Franklin were sitting on the porch, watching their son toddle around the yard with Bear following protectively behind him. "Can you believe it has been 2 years since you arrived?" Franklin asked, his arm around her shoulders. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Josephine said. "I was so scared that day. I thought you would take one look at me and send me back to Boston." "I am glad I did not," Franklin said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Josephine. You and Samuel." "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," she said, leaning into him. "I was so ashamed of my leg, so certain it made me less than other people, but you showed me that it is just part of who I am. It does not define me." "No," Franklin agreed, "it does not define you, but it does make you who you are, and I would not change a single thing about you." She turned to kiss him, her heart full of love and gratitude. They had both been broken in different ways when they found each other, both convinced that they were unworthy of love, but together they had built something beautiful and lasting. Samuel squealed and fell on his bottom, and Bear immediately licked his face, making the baby giggle. Franklin laughed and went to pick him up, swinging him high in the air. Samuel shrieked with delight, his chubby arms reaching for his father. Josephine watched them, her hand resting on her stomach, where a second baby was beginning to grow, though it was still too early to tell Franklin. She would wait another month until she was certain, but she was fairly sure. The tiredness, the slight queasiness in the mornings, all the familiar signs. She smiled, thinking about how full their house would be with 2 children. It would be chaotic and noisy and wonderful. Exactly what Franklin had said he wanted that day so long ago: a family, noise, someone to share his life with. They had built that together, and Josephine knew, with absolute certainty, that this was where she belonged, not in spite of her limp, but because of everything that made her who she was. Franklin had seen past the surface to the person underneath, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the freedom to be herself. The sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple. Franklin brought Samuel back to the porch, and Josephine took her son in her arms, pressing a kiss to his soft hair. Franklin sat beside her, his hand covering hers, and they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "I love you," Josephine whispered. "I love you too," Franklin replied, "always." And as the night settled around them, full of cricket song and the gentle breeze that swept across the grassland, Josephine thought about how far she had come. From the frightened woman who stepped off the stagecoach 2 years ago to this moment, sitting on the porch of her home with her husband and son, another baby growing inside her, she had been transformed. But the most important transformation had been internal. She had learned that her worth was not tied to what other people thought of her, that her limp was simply a part of her story, not the whole story. She had learned that she was capable and strong and deserving of love, and Franklin had been right that first day. Her limp did make her who she was, but not in the way she had always feared. It had made her resilient, had taught her compassion, had given her the courage to take a chance on a new life when staying in Boston would have been so much easier. The years passed in a blur of hard work and laughter, of challenges overcome and dreams realized. Josephine gave birth to a daughter 18 months after Samuel was born, a beautiful girl with Franklin's honey-colored eyes and Josephine's blonde hair. They named her Elizabeth, and she was as spirited and determined as her mother. Franklin expanded the ranch, buying adjacent property when it became available. With James's help, and eventually with the help of 2 other ranch hands, they built the herd to over 500 head. The ranch prospered, and they were able to build the larger house Franklin had dreamed of, with separate bedrooms for the children and a proper study where Josephine kept the ranch's books. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved reading as much as his mother and had his father's quiet strength. Elizabeth was a whirlwind, always in motion, always asking questions, fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents. When Samuel was 7 and Elizabeth was 5, Josephine gave birth to twin boys, and the house became even more chaotic. Through it all, Franklin remained her anchor, her partner, her love. He never failed to tell her she was beautiful, never treated her any differently on the days when her leg pained her more than usual. He was a devoted father, patient and kind, teaching the children to ride and rope and care for the animals. He read to them in the evenings, his voice stumbling over the bigger words, but his determination never wavering. Josephine thrived in ways she had never imagined possible. She became involved in the community, helping to establish a small school in Madisonville so the children did not have to travel to the next town for education. She taught other women how to keep account books, sharing the skills she had learned as a girl. She wrote letters to her aunt in Boston, describing her life in Texas, and her aunt wrote back with amazement and pride. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Franklin surprised her with a trip to Fort Worth. They left the children with Margaret and Thomas and spent 3 days in the city, staying in a hotel and eating in restaurants and attending a play at the theater. It was the first time they had been alone together since Samuel was born, and Josephine felt like a young bride again. On the last night of their trip, as they were preparing for bed in the hotel room, Franklin pulled something from his saddlebag. "I have been saving for this for a long time," he said, holding out a small velvet box. Josephine opened it to find a gold ring with a small diamond set in the center. It was not large or ostentatious, but it was beautiful. "When we got married, I could not afford a ring," Franklin said. "I've always regretted that. I wanted you to have something to show the world that you are loved, that you are cherished." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks as Franklin slipped the ring onto her finger. "It is perfect," she whispered. "But Franklin, I have never needed a ring to know I am loved. You show me every single day." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to give it to you anyway." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion that had only deepened over the years. Josephine fell asleep in Franklin's arms, the ring on her finger catching the moonlight that streamed through the window. When they returned to the ranch, the children were wild with excitement, talking over each other as they tried to tell their parents everything that had happened in their absence. The house was loud and messy and full of love, and Josephine thought, not for the first time, that she was the luckiest woman in the world. As the children grew older, Josephine told them the story of how she and Franklin had met. She did not hide the truth about her journey to Texas or her fear that Franklin would reject her because of her limp. The children listened with rapt attention, and when she finished, Samuel, who was 13 by then, said thoughtfully, "I am glad you were brave enough to come, Mama, otherwise we would not be here." "Neither would I," Franklin added, pulling Josephine close. "Your mother is the bravest person I know." Elizabeth, 11, and fiercely protective of her mother, said, "If anyone ever says anything mean about your leg, I will punch them." "You will do no such thing," Josephine said firmly, but she was touched by her daughter's loyalty. "Violence is never the answer, Elizabeth." "Then I will tell them they are ignorant and wrong," Elizabeth amended. "That is better," Josephine said, "but the best response is simply to live your life well and not let their opinions matter to you." "Is that what you do?" one of the twins asked. "Most of the time," Josephine said honestly. "There are still days when I wish things were different, when I'm frustrated by my limitations, but then I remember that my leg is just one part of me. It does not define who I am or what I am capable of." "Papa says it makes you who you are," Samuel said. "He is right," Josephine said, smiling at Franklin. "It has made me stronger and more compassionate. It taught me not to judge people by appearances, and it led me to Texas and to your father. So yes, it makes me who I am, and I would not change it even if I could." Franklin squeezed her hand, and Josephine saw the pride in his eyes. They had built a good life together, not in spite of their struggles, but because of them. They had learned that love was not about perfection, but about acceptance, about seeing each other fully and choosing to stay anyway. The years continued to pass. Samuel went off to college in Austin, determined to study law, and wrote home regularly about his classes and his life in the city. Elizabeth declared her intention to run the ranch someday, and Franklin began teaching her everything he knew. The twins were inseparable, getting into trouble with alarming regularity but always looking out for each other. Franklin's hair began to gray at the temples, and Josephine noticed lines forming around his eyes and mouth, but he was still the same man she had fallen in love with. He still kissed her every morning before heading out to work, still read to her in the evenings, still told her she was beautiful. On their 20th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Samuel came home from Austin, and Margaret and Thomas and their grown children joined them for a dinner that lasted long into the night. There was food and laughter and music, and as Josephine looked around at all the people she loved, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Late that night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Josephine and Franklin sat on the porch together, just as they had so many times over the years. "Do you ever regret it?" Franklin asked quietly, "leaving Boston, coming here?" "Not once," Josephine said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be, with you." "I think about that day you arrived," Franklin said. "I was so nervous. I had built you up in my mind based on your letters, and I was terrified that you would take one look at me and want to leave." "I was terrified too," Josephine admitted. "I was certain you would send me away when you saw my limp." "I am glad neither of our fears came true," Franklin said. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. "You have given me everything I ever wanted, Josephine. A home, a family, a life worth living. I do not have the words to tell you how much I love you." "Then do not try," Josephine said, leaning into him. "Just show me. You have been showing me for 20 years, and I never get tired of it." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and Josephine thought about all the kisses they had shared over the years, all the moments of joy and sorrow, all the ordinary days that had added up to an extraordinary life. As they sat together under the vast Texas sky, surrounded by the land they had worked and the home they had built, Josephine knew that she had found exactly what she had been searching for when she stepped off that stagecoach so many years ago. She had found love, yes, but more than that, she had found acceptance. She had found a place where she could be fully herself, limp and all, and be loved not in spite of it, but because it was part of what made her who she was. Franklin had been right that first day. Her limp did make her who she was. It had shaped her character, her perspective, her strength. It had brought her to Texas and to him, and for that she would be forever grateful. The night deepened around them, full of stars and possibilities, and Josephine closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. She had come to Texas as a frightened mail-order bride, hiding a secret she thought would destroy her chances at happiness. She had found instead a man who saw past the surface to the person underneath, who loved her without reservation, who showed her every day that she was worthy of love. Together they had built a life that was richer and fuller than anything she had imagined. They had created a family, nurtured a ranch, become pillars of their community. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and they had emerged stronger for it. And through it all, Franklin had never wavered in his love for her. He had shown her again and again that her worth was not tied to her physical perfection, but to the content of her character. He had given her the freedom to be herself, and in doing so, he had given her everything. As they finally rose and went inside, Franklin's arm around her waist and her walking stick tapping softly against the porch boards, Josephine thought about all the women back in Boston who had pitied her, who had assumed she would never find love or happiness because of her limp. She wished she could tell them that they had been wrong, that she had found more love and happiness than most people ever dreamed of. But perhaps they would not have understood. Perhaps you had to walk the path yourself, had to take the risk and make the leap to understand that true love was not about perfection. It was about seeing and being seen, about accepting and being accepted, about building something together one day at a time. She had taken that leap of faith when she answered Franklin's advertisement, and it had changed her life in ways she could never have anticipated. She had learned that she was stronger than she thought, braver than she believed, and worthy of love not in spite of her imperfections, but as a complete person, flaws and all. Franklin had taught her that. Not through grand gestures or flowery words, but through steady, consistent love. Through his actions every single day, he had shown her that she mattered, that she was valued, that she was enough exactly as she was. And in teaching her that, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the ability to love herself. As they climbed into bed that night, Franklin pulled her close, and Josephine rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. This was home, she thought, not the house, or the land, or even Texas. Home was here, in the arms of the man who had loved her from the first day they met, who had seen her completely and chosen her anyway. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Franklin replied, his voice already thick with sleep. Always and forever. Josephine smiled and closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep, feeling safe and loved and profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought her here. She had started as a mail-order bride ashamed of her limp, and she had become a wife, a mother, a rancher, a woman who knew her own worth. And it had all begun with a cowboy who looked at her limp and said, "It makes you who you are." Those words had changed everything. They had given her permission to stop hiding, to stop being ashamed, to embrace all of herself. And in embracing herself, she had been able to fully embrace the life she and Franklin had built together. As she drifted off to sleep, Josephine's last conscious thought was one of pure contentment. She had found her place in the world, and it was here in Texas, with Franklin and their children and the life they had created together. She had found her home, her love, her purpose, and she had never been happier.